So here's a reason not to let a bunch of algae grow in your flats. Look at this. So all the roots are in this top layer that's just crusted out and was colonized by algae and whatever else. I watered this probably 8 o'clock this morning. It's 1:30 now. On a really hot day, it's probably 100 degrees out. 30-40% shade cloth over the greenhouse, so it's not insanely hot in here. Anyway, between 8 and 1:30, this all dried out and just lifted up like that. That's the worst flat, but it's not the only one. You can see this one's doing the same thing. And it smells like an old pond in here. Today I'm dealing with this problem. I have all this algae growth on my cactus flats. As you can see, you know, in order to keep this from happening where they dry and curl up, I have to water this at least twice a day. And you can see here that like the roots of the cactus are literally being pulled out. What I'll do is I'll cut this a line, which is like, this is one variety from here to here, take all this stuff off, and then replant them in rows. So the only good thing about that is areas like this strip right here where I have like very poor germination, I can consolidate everything and end up with fewer flats in the long run. This one I did, I think yesterday. You know, it wasn't horrible. It maybe took me like 40 minutes or something. If it takes an average of an hour flat, you know, it's like a 20-hour job here. Fortunately, not all of them probably need it. I think almost all of them have at least a little bit of that effect. You know, this one's pretty bad. That one's really bad right there. But some of them probably won't need to be transplanted. But I do have flats like this where I just had really bad germination on a few varieties and I need to transplant them anyway. So yeah, created a bunch of extra work. Now, one possibility why I had so much algae this year, more than usual, because sometimes I get it and sometimes I don't, is I use some forest stuff, which is just like the, you know, the organic matter that's mostly decayed underneath the leaves, but on top of the soil. And I just did that for microbes, you know, to add more diversity of microbes into the soil. But I probably added a bunch of like moss and algae spores too. However, I didn't do that with all this soil, and it seems like almost every flat has at least, you know, a little bit of that effect. It's just that on some it's much thicker. Another thing I did with probably like this one and this one, some of the worst ones where it's really thick, is I sprinkled some powdered neem cake. So neem cake is the stuff, just the junk left over after they press out the neem oil. And I was using it to treat fungus gnats, and I thought, well, I'll just powder it really fine and I'll sprinkle it on so that it's always there, and when I water it goes down into the soil and kills them and everything. So immediately that stuff started to rot and mold, and I had flats where like the tops of the cactus were all covered in mold, and I had to spray it with peroxide, hydrogen peroxide, a couple times, which totally took care of the mold. But I think in the meantime, it grew like a lot of mycelium and made this biofilm here much thicker. When you go to the edge of like a stagnant pond and there's the algae growing right on the edge of the pond, and it has a certain like, you know, pondy algae smell, that's what it smells like in here when I water. So I really don't know how to avoid that. If anyone has any ideas on how to avoid algae or how to kill algae without killing the cactus, which I doubt is possible, let me know. One other thing that may help is not keeping them as wet. So I have, you know, flat acrylic lids on these, and I don't really prop them open or anything, like some air leaks around the edges, but I'll grow them up to about this stage here where I feel comfortable taking them off as long as I'm watering a lot. So I don't really have as much air circulation as I probably could. So that may be one potential solution, is just having more air circulation earlier on. Yeah, so in this case, I just have a flat with hardly anything in it. I don't know what went wrong with this flat, but I can just say, okay, well, this is one variety from here to there. Pop these guys out and use them to fill in this other flat. And I will transplant these guys at a very small size if I have to. And they usually survive. It's just a matter of whether they get enough water. As usual, I had a bunch of mishaps this year. You know, I'm still dialing in the system. I don't have the infrastructure I need. I'm on solar, so it's hard for me to run a lot of lights, which is kind of more like the safest way to do it. I tried to grow some in natural light, but under shade cloth. A layer of shade cloth and a layer of remay on a table, and that didn't work out. They ended up drying out, getting too hot, because the acrylic lid on top of this, you know, is a secondary solar gain. Let's say it gets to 110 degrees in here on a hot day, which it easily does, or hotter. but I also have an acrylic lid on top of this. Now inside there, it's going to get to 130 or more. And, you know, I've actually killed cactus that way. And that's pretty much what happened again this year, even with shade cloth. It may have even had like 2 layers of shade cloth. I don't remember. But that experiment did not work out. I need to find a place with electricity that I can use, unless I move somewhere with electricity soon, and grow them under lights until they're sized up enough to take outside or put like in a greenhouse like this. You know, my system here is supposed to avoid having to do this, and eventually I think I'll get there, especially if I start doing germination tests. So I know which batches of seed are good and which aren't, and if I get a bad batch of seed, I can broadcast it. Yeah, so my system is supposed to avoid having to do this. And it often does. It's just, you know, still working out wrinkles. You can't solve problems until you have all the problems and understand what's going to go wrong. And I'll settle these in with a nice gentle spray here. Anyway, I was saying, you know, varieties, if I do germination tests, which by the way, I think seed sellers need to start doing germination tests. I've had so much problem with poor germination. Eventually, I'm going to start doing germination tests whenever I get a batch of seeds and reporting back which batches of seed and who has good and bad germination, because I can plant, you know, 1 or 2 rows of each variety in one flat, avoiding the edges where there often is a worse germination. And then I have an A/B comparison across the board to everything else. So if one is like 95% and then one is like 20%, you know, it's probably the seed and not me or the conditions. Because everyone else does germination testing, but for cactus people, nobody seems to do it. And I've spent tons of money on exotic seed and had very poor germination rates in some cases, and that's just not cool. Now you'll notice that almost all my seedlings are red or brown. Some people worry about that and they think there's something wrong. But really, if you put them in natural light when they're young like this, they're going to turn red. It's just a protective mechanism for light stress. They'll do it for light stress, heat stress, nutrition stress. It's just a little phase they go through, and then they'll outgrow it when they get a little bit bigger. And you start, you know, making sure they have plenty of food and water. Like these guys, you see how they're starting to green up on the top? In probably 2 or 3 weeks, a lot of those will be completely green. You can see a lot of these are green, a lot of those are green. It's just a matter of giving them everything they want and them reaching a certain phase of maturity. So if I have these under lights, which I did, they'll all be green, and then I move them out here, and within a few days they start turning red. Not a problem. Don't worry about that. Also in the wintertime, I'll take these. They might all be green, and I'll just stop watering because I don't want them all wet in the wintertime. They can get rust and other diseases because it's just generally humid. They're not growing. And I'll dry them off and they'll turn really red. A lot of them will just be brown. Sometimes people write me and they're like, hey, there's something wrong with this cactus you sent me. It looks brown. Is it rotting? You know, no, that's just stress because I'm not watering them all winter long. I water a little bit, just a little dose here and there. And that's just them protecting themselves in that dry condition. I mean, they're cactus. They're tough. They have their ways. So gently popping these guys out. Make sure I get as much root as possible, but none of this algae layer. I haven't had too much trouble with the cactus rotting in this algae, but I think it does probably make them more susceptible. So I'm very happy to get rid of it. I don't think that it's going to grow back, because they're not going to be wet enough for algae to be growing. Now, all of these cactus are planted on a diagonal grid. So the straight lines here run this way. And let's find a better example. So if you look at it this way, each one is staggered. So there's 1, 2, and then this one's offset. See, each row is offset. And you can fit a lot more cactus in the same flat that way than you can if you plant them in rows and they're actually lined up. So let's say you want them 1 inch apart in the row, and you do 1 inch straight, 1 inch here, straight, 1 inch here, etc. So it looks like a checkerboard. You're going to fit considerably less cactus. Do the math. You could draw it out and you can do the math, because the distance between here and here, let's say I'm going for 1 inch, which this isn't. This is like, I don't know, it's, Yeah, it's 7/8. So this distance is less than 7/8. It's more like 3/4 of an inch. So that means you're going to fit a lot more rows packed in. And when I transplant, I've used the same offset grid pattern. Okay, and now I can just get rid of all this. Again, it's not going to grow back because it's not going to be wet enough to grow back. So I'm just eyeballing this around an inch to 7/8. And I've done this enough that it's pretty easy for me to eyeball the straight lines. You know, you have to do the math to figure out exactly what it is if you're setting up trays to seed and draw it all out. I'll show my whole system sometime, but it's basically a flat board with a bunch of brass tacks on it that are set up in exactly this pattern, like very precise. And so I just press that into the soil and it leaves all the divots exactly where I want the seeds. And it's a big investment, but for me growing so many, it's way worth it. I made I think 3 or 4 of those press plates now. Yeah, 4. And they're different spacings, and one is for 10-20 flats versus these acrylic food service trays. These come in a standard size because they're made to fit, you know, along with like the stainless steel ones that people use for like hot foods. They're all standardized to the same size. They're a little expensive, but I like them because they let light in the edges. So when they're young like this, I can plant them, you know, a little bit below the surface, which leaves plenty of soil, even more than you really need. But I can put a lid on them for a long time. So if I need to move them or something like that, you know, until they actually grow above this rim, I can keep using these flat acrylic lids, which look like this right here. See, for someone doing moderate amounts, you know, or small amounts, just go with the 10-20 trays, but get the heavy duty ones like Super Sprouter, not the flimsy, you know, ones that cost like $1.50, but get the ones that cost like $3.50, you know. When you go to move them, they're just more rigid, so you don't end up tweaking the flat as you're moving it, and you know, the soil will crack and everything will move around. So get the rigid ones, and even they're not as convenient as these, which are super rigid. So I can move these and transport them in my car and stuff as much as I want. I can put these lids on, they're flat. These are food service trays that are made for stacking. You know, you can stack 10 of them on top of each other. So I can just tape the lids on with some masking tape. So with the 10-20 trays, there's these lids that I use that are about 2 inches tall, and they're like a thin, cheap, clear plastic with little vent holes in them. And that's the lid I would recommend using. But you can't stack those. Like, you're not going to get away with stacking a bunch of those things. They're just too flimsy. We don't all have the same considerations depending on how many you're growing, and investing in a bunch of these acrylic flats like I did. It was a big investment. And I don't let people walk off with these trays if they want to buy a whole flat worth. I take it out of the flat and put it in like a cheap 10-20 or something. These will yellow over time, but it's not a problem. It's just the same yellowing you get on like a fiberglass greenhouse plastic. It's going to be many years until that's actually a legitimate problem. Another thing that may contribute to this problem is that this is a top layer of soil that's finer than the soil in the bottom of the tray. So the soil on the bottom of the tray is more like a potting mix with a little bit bigger chunks of charcoal that I'd want to just grow cactus in, right? In fact, when I'm done with it, I just dump it into a pot and plant cactus in it. It's like, you know, ready-made potting mix. But the top layer, where the seeding happens, is an extra fine layer of like charcoal. Let's see, I put in some vermiculite and coconut coir, sifted very fine. And that may contribute to the algae like growing in that and consolidating it together and having it just peel up like that. Now that's like something I'm not likely to change because I do it for a reason. I want that super fine layer that the seeds can germinate in, that has a higher water holding capacity and takes the indentations from my marking boards really well. The tacks I get are cone-headed tacks. They're about 1/4 inch, I think, and I got them on Etsy. They're not super cheap, but I tried some different tacks, and that's the one I like. I like the cone head tack because it makes a cone-shaped pit, and the seed is more likely to roll down into the center. So it's okay to bury these a little deep. Like, you're going to end up planting them deeper than they're growing. I see that as a good thing. It makes them more stable. It doesn't tend to hurt them. I'm sure there's a slightly bigger chance that they'll end up rotting at the base, which is just a problem sometimes with young cactus, especially if you get like that infection in your flats of whatever that rot bacteria stuff is. You know, they're more stable, and you want to more make sure that they're deep enough than that they're not too deep. However, if they are too deep, you have less surface area of the cactus collecting light, which is critical. It's one of the reasons I think they grow so slow in the beginning, is they just aren't gathering enough energy from the sun. Their bodies are so small they can't collect a lot of energy until they get to a certain size. Now when they get to about this size right here, maybe like 3/8 of an inch, then they'll start to really take off and grow fast. So a lot of these cactus will be ready in, 4 weeks. Some of these are almost a ½ inch, which I usually start selling them, like even these guys, so they're doing good. Other ones are behind because I started like 4 different phases of cactus. If I had my way, I would be starting them in January, February under lights with heat mats. Don't have the power, especially in the wintertime when the sun's low. My solar power just isn't adequate. Here's some interesting seed. This is SSO2 with TPM. Could be interesting. I've been at this literally for days now. I think I've been transplanting seedlings for 3 days, and I have 16 flats finished, and then part of another one. Man, it's really slow and tedious. I can't do it all day long, but I have been at it for 3 days, and it's mostly what I've done for 3 days. The reason that I seed cactus with a pair of tweezers is because I've always said I'd rather seed 1,000 cactus seeds with tweezers than transplant 1,000 seedlings. And yeah, I've confirmed that that is how I feel about it, and I was right. It's really, really tedious transplanting all these seedlings. Now you can see this flat here where I broadcast some seed because I thought it was probably going to have a poor germination rate. Well, all of it didn't turn out to have a poor germination rate, as you can see. So, imagine untangling that mess and transplanting all those into a grid pattern in these flats. And that's why I don't do that. Now, the one advantage to doing this is that, you have the seedlings established already, and these flats are going to be pretty full. I mean, I'm sure a few cactus will die, but not too many. Whereas if you get, poor germination, you get a bad batch of seed or something like this, then, you end up with a flat that has a lot of empty spaces in it, which isn't great. But overall, I think, the way I approach it with marking it all off, you can see like this flat did really well. And sowing by hand 1 seed at a time is, it is what I should be doing. I just maybe need to do some germination tests and dial everything a little bit and try to solve this algae problem. Here's a bunch of mutants from this year. So these are from last year's batch. And I've already pulled out the best crests, so most of these are like, kind of contorted a little bit or a little bit crusty, but the very best crests I've already pulled out. So these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and hopefully those will end up looking like these from last year, which there's some really, these 3 right here, really great ones. I will be continuing to do seedlings the way I do it, with marking them out and dropping in 1 seed at a time, and I'm just going to try to keep increasing the efficiency on that process and, somehow make sure that the flats end up full and that I don't have to do any transplanting because of this like massive algae problem.